would like to introduce a workshop on religion and violence that will be facilitated by Dr. Kelly James Clark, Senior Research Fellow at Kaufman Interfaith Institute, the Honors Program at Brooks College, Grand Valley State University, Grand Rapids, Michigan. And with all due, I'm just going to hand this over to you.
Thank you very much, and thanks, Basil, for inviting me to do this. He did advertise this as a workshop, but I planned it sort of as a talk, and I'm going to try to keep you interested, and if you have questions, you can stop and ask at any time during the talk, so feel free to interrupt me. There will be time at the end. I'm sure plenty of you will have things that you disagree with or things that you'd like to add to it. So we'll make that sort of the workshop-y part of it. He interviewed me a couple of months ago after he read this article I wrote, Dangerously Uninformed, and I think it's the article, I'd like to say I exploded some myths about religion and violence. I'm sort of a reporter on some of this. There are people that are on the front lines doing really cool research on what's really going on with respect to religion and violence. And I think if we're looking at conflict resolution where there's a sort of religious element here, I think we really need to understand what it is that is actually motivating people to their conflicts, to their disagreements, and sometimes to violence, and sometimes even to extremist violence. And so I'm a philosopher, but I read a lot of psychology. I read anthropologists. I read people that interview and talk with extremists. And hearing some of your talks today, I know some of you do that too. You probably know more about some of this than I do. At any rate, I'll just push ahead here. And here's the main myth that I want to explode, and it's a myth that's been popular from the new atheists for most of the 21st century, and it's the myth that religion is the root of evil. And Richard Dawkins even made a documentary about this and spends the whole day. I put it in a question like he does. He doesn't really come out and say it, but he implies it, that religion really is the source of all the evil that there is in the world. All of the human conflicts, he thinks, boil down to conflicts between people who are disputing over religious issues. So Christopher Hitchens, also recently deceased new atheist, says religion poisons everything. In one of his books, Sam Harris makes claims to the similar claims, and Richard Dawkins writes religion is the root of all evil. And then there's this general assumption, I think, behind all these people. If we could just get rid of religion, then everything would be fine. Religion's the problem, and so what we need to do is get rid of religion. I guess my own view is human beings as such are inclined not to really get along very well, and that if we could get rid of all the religions tomorrow, we'd find some other reason not to get along, and would have a new name, and we'd find other ways to defend ourselves and also to inflict harm on other people if we can. And so what I want to do is look at, yeah. Oh, yeah. There's no end, actually. It's a funny thing to me that after the 20th century, where a few 100 million were killed in the name of Nazism, Stalinism, and Maoism, they could think that, which are in principle not theistic or religious, they could think that religion somehow is the thing that motivates people. I think those three isms combined for more human deaths in the history of humankind than all of the religions put together, and that all within one short 50-year period. What I want to do is look at the kind of evolutionary and cognitive psychology that inclines us to intolerance, that inclines us not to get along, that inclines us even to violence on occasion. And some of it's rooted in evolutionary psychology, how we evolved evolutionarily and how that shaped us to react in various ways to people around us. We like to think that we're mostly rational actors, but I think most of the time we're pretty instinctive actors, and we've been shaped evolutionarily in the kinds of instincts and impulses that we have in throughout our evolutionary history. And I'm going to talk quite a bit about the evolution of cooperation. How is it that human beings began to be cooperators? Because the one thing we all know about evolution is that it's sort of survival of the fittest, that that there's a battle, a struggle for existence. We're struggling for existence not just with other species, but also with members of our own species. And not just us, of course, every single biological creature that has ever existed. And so we know it wouldn't be hard for me, I think, to explain evolutionarily how we became selfish. I think that'd be really easy to explain. It's not so easy to explain how it is that human beings became cooperative. And interestingly, it's not just human beings that are cooperative. Other animal species are cooperative too. And so I'm going to just look at evolution and how evolution was able to accomplish something that looks on the face of it quite difficult, that is cooperation. So I'm going to look at cooperation, or in the end I'm going to call it alliance, or the things that bring us in group. But the other thing I want to look at is conflict. We have evolved ways that have suited us well for conflict. We are in competition with other species and with one another for scarce resources. And so we not only have an evolutionary and cognitive story to tell about cooperation, we have one that I think is pretty persuasive to tell about conflict. And in the end, I'll make this, I'm going to try to make it simple and make the key basic points. I think we've evolved in various ways, different sorts of cognitive mechanisms that have helped us form in-group. And that's good, and we cooperate, and there are cooperative benefits. That's good. Alliance, good. But the very things that drive us in-group also create out-group. And out-groups are, at least throughout human history, out-groups were almost always enemy. And our responses to in-group friend, out-group enemy, these are pretty deep impulses in the very roots of our being, and they're shaped, 2 million years ago on the Serengeti, and even before. They're shaped, I think, in pre-human species, and we've inherited these, and we need to understand these if we're going to be able to understand how it is that we can get out of the predicaments that we find ourselves in. Well, so here's the first impulse. I'm talking about alliance, and I think our first and our most instinctive impulse is for ourself. And I don't know another way to say it except it's kind of cute. Self-alliance, self-reliance, self-alliance. The rest of them will make more sense. There actually are alliances. I can't really ally with myself. You need at least one other, but play along with me. I think our first and most instinctive and our deepest and most primitive impulse is for ourself, to get food, to get sleep, to mate. I know she said that sandwich looks so good when you were over here, and her impulse is to want it, and your impulse is not to share. Anyway, so these are our deepest, most primitive impulses, and they're built into every biological creature that there is. There's no completely other regarding, or even mostly other regarding creature that exists on the history of this planet. And the reason is if that were the case, evolution would have just selected them right out. It selects out generosity because generosity benefits somebody else. And evolution really selects traits that benefit ourself. And so these are our deepest, most primitive instincts, and they're governed by the 4 F's. And we already know one of them, feeding. So the 4 F's are fighting, feeding, fleeing, and reproducing. If you're not a native English speaker, just ask somebody next to you, okay? They won't mind explaining this. And what we find in these deep impulses is we find human beings are really territorial because land is where we get our food, and land is where we live, and land is the place we've carved out that's ours, that makes us safe, that helps us satisfy our own needs and desires. But we also have this impulse to fear, and we fear everything that's not us. I was walking today along the river, and a woman was walking her dog, and she went over to let her dog go sniff in the bushes, and all of a sudden this other dog just appeared from the other side, and she jumped. And she jumped because she was afraid for herself. Everything else is competitor. It took for a second. As soon as she realized, dog, safe, owner, she could talk herself down from this kind of instinctive fear that she had of this other thing that she viewed as a competitor. And we have these native impulses that react with fear if we find that our basic four F's, fighting, feeding, fleeing, and reproducing, if those are in jeopardy. And in the face of threats to self, if we're starving and someone comes to steal our food, or if we're sleeping, we see someone has taken over our house, if we've shot something, we go and protect it. In the face of threats to self, our natural instinct is to fight or flight. That's our natural instinct. We'll come back to that. It's not hard to explain why it is if someone attacks us, we might attack them back, right? If they're a threat to us, we might respond with violence. That's not hard to explain. But we also have what's called, in other places, kin selection. I call it here kin alliance. And we're not only concerned for ourselves, we also have pretty deep and instinctive love of, care for members of our own family. And sometimes I actually think I love my own children more than myself. And we've evolved this, and it's not just humans that have it. You can find it in many primate communities. It's actually all over the biological realm, but primate communities, you find a level of caring with kin. Even these little prairie dogs. I love these. So this is a prairie dog. I give an example of it. This is how powerful kin alliance is. A prairie dog, if it sees a predator or hears a predator, usually maybe a bird flying over in the sky, if it sees or hears a predator, one of the prairie dogs will stand up and make a loud noise. And you have to if you've seen prairie dogs, you know that the grass is very low. They eat all the grass around them, and they live in the ground below. So by sticking their heads up and not running into the tunnels below, they've made themselves the most available to the predator. They've put themselves in the most dangerous situation that they can be in. And it seems like evolution would just select out creatures like that. If there's creatures that are so kind they stick their neck up for other members of their species, looks like nature would just get rid of them. But instead, evolution understands that there are lots of ways to get your genes into the next generation. One is by having sex with somebody. Another is by laying your life down for your child. That's another way to do it. That gets your genes safely into the next generation. And so other regarding behavior evolved even in animal species. Oh, it's interesting. If you take the prairie dog from his little prairie dog neighborhood and you move him 20 miles away and you stick him in another neighborhood with other prairie dogs, they won't do it. They will only do it for kin. Now, the spadefoot toad is another example. That spadefoot toad, the interesting thing about spadefoot toads is they eat other spadefoot toad babies. So you can see spadefoot toad mama giving birth, and then 5 minutes later she's running around eating other spadefoot toad babies, little tiny babies, eating them. Except this, if she takes a spadefoot toad into her mouth and it's one of hers, she can detect it and she spits it out. So kin selection's really powerful. It's totally operative, but it only explains why it is we have such powerful love for members of our own family, and probably especially our own children. So the domain of cooperation expands from me. It expands to me and mine. It expands to my kin, and it expands to blood relatives. There are lots of interesting studies, for example, about the kind of care that fathers might have for their daughters. Here's an interesting thing. Fathers don't have as much care and concern for their adopted daughters. Blood kin is a really powerful motivator in this. I think also interestingly, female members of species are also seem to have more of this than male members of species. There are lots of interesting side effects. But so here's one. I said, sometimes I think I might do more for my kids than I do for myself. It also has built in kind of social urges or impulses. So we take pleasure in helping our offspring. And there's pain that we have when they're hurt. That's how deep evolution has outfitted us to care for our offspring. Well, if there are threats to kin, here's the point I want to make. If someone threatens your kin, here's what you want to do, fight or flight. Well, hopefully mostly fight. But if someone does something that harms or is about to harm your child, you have a really deep impulse to fight them, to fight back. I remember one time I was skiing, and I'm not much of a swearer, actually. I almost never swear. And I was skiing with my son, and some teenager, big teenager, bigger than me, came skiing down the hill, and I saw him. He was skiing right towards my son, and he was totally out of control. And he was headed towards my 5-year-old son. And I quickly went like this with my skis because they're hard to move in. And I got right in front of him, and the guy knocked me down, completely down, knocked me out of my skis, knocked my glasses off. And I stood up, and I swore like a sailor at him because I was protecting my kid. I didn't decide to swear and throw my body out. I just did it. That's how powerful kin selection is. It's in everybody. If there's a threat to my kin, I'm going to fight. And I think, to me, it's no surprise if a drone strike hits a village and kills somebody's brother or mother or child, it's no surprise to me that they want to get us back, that they want to fight. Yeah.
I think a lot of this, there's a lot of elements of how mankind or human beings are a part of nature and not separate from it in your discussion. And I'm thinking that if an eye for an eye or something, or wanting to get revenge is natural in a sense, then breaking that cycle of violence and say with forgiveness or something like that is kind of contemplated like the next step in evolution. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I fear that it's not the next step in evolution, but I think what this shows is how difficult conflict resolution really is. And it shows how deep our instincts are to fight when we're threatened. So they're pretty deep. Hopefully we'll evolve to compassion. But I don't think we're sort of natively very compassionate. To our kin we are, and in really powerful ways. But I think we can understand why, if you're in a culture where the U.S. shoots down bombs and kills one of your kin, you want to fight. So anyway, part of it is to sort of lay the grounds for why it is so difficult for us to do conflict or to work in conflict resolution. All right, I'm going to do one more that we're pretty sure happens. Around 100,000 or 200,000 BC, human beings began to develop agricultural techniques. And around 10,000 BC, they just took off. And human beings stopped living in simple kin groups, where your kin group is in and then every other one is out, and began to live in tribes. And tribes could get pretty big, and they needn't be small. But tribal living took off after the agricultural revolution, and people began to be increasingly socially cooperative, and I think to evolve some cooperative skills after about 200 or 100,000 years ago. And this is tribal alliance. And what we find are cooperative non-kin groups or tribes that developed during the agricultural revolution. And I think they developed because there are lots of cooperative benefits. In hunter-gatherer societies, there are some cooperative benefits, but you could do it in a family of 40 or 50. It's easier to hunt in groups. But maybe if you have 40 or 50, that might be enough. But if you have agriculture, you need a lot of people to do a lot of things and a lot of different things if you want to be successful at it. So there were cooperative benefits. There's a specialization of labor that we find in agricultural societies. Shared child rearing. Child rearing is evolutionarily very costly, especially for women. Not so costly for men who might just ignore it, but for women it's super costly because it takes women away from fighting, feeding, fleeing, and reproducing. So evolutionary, it's very costly. If you can share it, then somebody can spend more time weeding the crops or bringing in the crops. You can hunt in groups, have different sorts of groups that hunt. There's increased genetic diversity in bigger groups. You can have stronger armies. There's shared learning, and so you can pass things on from generation to generation. You can see how tribes are going to get bigger and bigger and bigger once you start developing these. I just put a few. But what happened in early human tribal communities is that the cooperative benefits outweighed the costs. And there are risks. There are risks of living in community with people who aren't your kin. So there are costs for doing that, but the benefits sufficiently outweighed the costs. But if there are threats to tribe, if someone threatens your tribe, then I think our natural instinct is fight or flight. And actually, I think almost all the conflicts we see in the world today are tribal. And I mean tribal in some big global sense. I don't think they're mostly religious. I think that groups of people who are grouped in various ways, we like to think it's religion that groups them, but they're grouped in various ways. Their basic ways of life have been threatened and harmed, and their natural instinct is to fight. So I've talked about alliance here quite a bit, but again, the thing that brings us together in groups, the thing that makes in-groups, say in a tribe, so we've got the self, the family, and the tribe, and in a sense we've seen the circle of cooperation expand, but it isn't really very big yet, because nearly everyone in the world doesn't live in my tribe. So most people are still out-group. I have notes here which I can't see here. I just want to point out, and I've already made this point, in-group creates out-group. That in-group friend creates out-group enemy. Not always. People traded with out-groups, but we developed ways to identify and trust in-group, and other ones to trust, but not so much out-group. And if there was fierce competition for things, out-group trust broke down nearly immediately. And there were also cultural adaptations, and they generated differences. And they did this really quickly. They rapidly generated differences between local social groups because you had to know who was in your tribe. Early human beings had to know who was in and who was out. You didn't get to go out and walk around and see somebody out there and think, well, that looks kind of like my cousin Larry. The hair looks a little different, maybe not quite the same size. And then you think about it for a long time. You say, hey, Larry, and while your arm's up, an arrow goes through your heart. You don't have time. You have to instantly know who's in and who's out. And so we have developed super sensitive cognitive abilities to determine who's in our group and who's out of our group. And some of them are really obvious, like clothing and tattoos. But it turns out, or paint. I think that's one of the reasons we see all these in different groups, because that's an easy way to determine who's in and who's out. But here's another way. People who are not in our group, they smell different from us. One time I picked up a friend from China, and he had been on the plane, and so he hadn't showered for a long time, so he had more of his smell, the China person smell. And I picked him up, and honestly, is this going to be on video? I'll take out his name. I thought he stunk. And here's the thing I figured out later, like 10 years later, that's the way it's supposed to be. We're supposed to have really sensitive abilities to tell who's in group and who's out group. And if someone eats slightly different food than we eat, it doesn't take much for us to identify people who are in our group. They smell good. People who are in another group, they smell bad. Accents develop very quickly, and human beings are very good at detecting accents. In-group, out-group. Happens very quickly. There are all sorts of tribal markers, and we're really good at identifying them. And we're really good at identifying them. We do it instantly, and we do it instantly because we didn't have time, or people who took the time to think about someone who's in-group or out-group, they got selected out. They were killed. They got selected out. Our ancestors who did it really quickly, they're the ones that survived, and they passed on the detect tribal marker genes that we all have, and we do it really quickly. I'm going to tell you the story tomorrow. I'll just tell it quickly to you now. I work really hard. I work with Muslim groups a lot. I love my Muslim brothers and sisters. But if I'm on an airplane and a man in a robe with a long beard stands up quickly, my heart starts beating. I'm thinking terrorist. I was on a plane one time, and the plane landed, and I heard someone say, Allahu Akbar. and I thought a bomb was going to go off. My heart started beating, and I was responding to these markers, just like that. I don't want to be like that, but if we're honest, we are like that. And until we understand that, we'll never get anywhere in figuring out how to relate to one another as human beings. These markers kick in quickly, and we make judgments quickly. And again, we can understand why in our world today, not such a great thing, but it's in there. For 2 million years, it was a great thing, and it's built into all of us. Religion is also a tribal marker. Religion was a signal to people in your group that you could be trusted, and it's also people that did that, you were sure they could be trusted. If people didn't do your religion, they were not in your group. It's a tribal marker. We make it, in our day and age, and I'll look at why we do this, we tend to think it's the identifying characteristic of another human being. I don't think that of myself, actually. I don't think my religion is the thing that most identifies me. I'm an American. I'm a father. I'm a husband. I live in Michigan. Some of you live in New York. I don't know how you do it, but I know you're a different species, sort of. And some of you live in Africa, and I hear different stories about that. It's not. I have multiple identities, and religion's just one of them. But we tend to pick that out. I'll give a reason why we pick that out and think that's the tribal marker that really identifies who a human being is. Again, I don't do it to myself, but we do it to other people. And just to summarize, conflict arises over threats to self, kin, and tribe. And what are some threats? I just want to get what some of those are. Well, and then historically, and land, I mean big, in some big metaphorical way. If somebody takes or occupies our land, that's a threat. If they take over our land, if they move into your country and they take your oil and then export it to their country and take the profits, and then you live in poverty. Land in a really big sense. Food, water, if they take your autonomy, and I haven't developed this, but there's lots of psychological mechanisms operating with respect to honor and shame, often as they relate to you as a family member, but also sometimes members of tribes. But if somebody has blasted your mother to bits, you've been shamed, and it's your honor. It's your honor to avenge your mother's death. So there are lots of mechanisms. I haven't had a chance to look at all of them. These are the things that motivate us to do this. Not people's tattoos, not their clothing, not the way they paint them up, how they smell, not their accent. That isn't what motivates. If someone has a different accent, we don't kill them. If someone has different paint on, we don't kill them usually. But if someone with different paint on comes in and tries to steal our land, then we do kill them. And if someone comes in with different paint on or a different accent and they steal our wives, then we do kill them. We don't kill over the markers, we kill over these things. And honestly, I think it's just a bizarre way to think of human beings, to think that we kill over tribal markers and not land and food and honor and shame, not our most fundamental human needs. So that's what I think conflict rises over. And then religion, I think, is a recruiting tool. When land has been taken, or honor or shame, religion can be a recruiting tool, and it can be a force multiplier. But I think, in general, religion is pretty low on the structure of motivation for people being motivated to violence. I think, in general, you might just look around the world and see. I live in Michigan. Dearborn is the biggest Muslim population in the United States. People are pretty well off. They have houses and land and access to food and fairly good rights. I think there are problems with Islamophobia in America, but overall I think they live pretty good lives. I do not live in fear of Dearborn Muslims. And they have the same religion, we'll come back to that, as ISIS, but they're Muslims, and many people think Muslim is bad. I am not tempted to battle them over their religion, and they aren't tempted to battle me either. If we go over there and we try to take their land, they probably will battle us, but it won't be because they're Muslims, it's because we're taking their land. If we take away their rights or their autonomy, then I think they'll fight back. But that's because we take their rights and autonomy, not because we take, not because we have different religious beliefs. Yeah.
But you do all these things because they have different religion. You will harm them because they are different, and they are different because they have different religious faith.
That's not what.
You mean people just run around killing people because they have different religions, or because they want their food or their oil or their women?
The distinction between them and us, they are taking our wives, they are taking our food, they are taking our resources. Who are they? People who have different religions.
Right. They also may have different clothes, and they might have different beard lengths, and they might have different hair. There might be all sorts, but I don't think that's why they're taking our religion.
The same.
What?
They may have the same clothes and the same everything, but they take their land or land.
They might, and if they do, we'll fight back. Yes. Yeah, but we won't fight back just because they're sitting over there not taking our land and because they have a different religion. We're not going to fight them if they do that. And they're not going to fight us if we don't do it. Yeah.
It was just like to talk about his point. So when Sudan was one country and they were having like a civil war, people used the fact that the South was Christian and the North was Muslim to separate them. However, now that it's separated between Sudan and South Sudan is still in conflict. And now they're using tribal differences to separate them. Because at the end of the day, the people that want to separate them don't care about their religion, they don't care about their tribe, they care about their oil. The same way in Nigeria, you have people who are trying to separate Nigeria between Muslim and Christian. However, when they go into the Christian part of Nigeria and they sow their oil waste into Nigerian water, do they care that they're Christians just like the Nigerian Christians? Because it's a British Christian company that's doing this, but they don't care because it's all about resources. So no, religion is used as a tool to like separate us, just like racists, just like tribalism is, but that's not the reason why people fight each other. The reason why people fight each other is what he's saying is like resources. All these wars are resource wars. They're not wars for religion.
What's your name?
Shirley.
God bless you, Shirley.
Totally agree here. Totally agree here.
Well,
I wonder, I mean, it sounds like you're talking about defensive mechanisms, like someone attacks us, so we'll fight back. Like we're threatened. What about like the offensive groups? You know what I mean?
So if you're hungry, you'll attack. I mean, you can take these and apply it to offensive warfare as well. If you're.
What about like, well, to be right on the nose, what about the early expansion of Islam? Right? I mean, we're not hungry. We're a group of Muslims. We have a cohesive group, military power. We're expanding, but it's not because we're hungry. What is it?
So we're going to be, sorry, what I'd like to do is get one more slide up here, and I'm not going to be able to explain everything all the time. I said it's low on the structure of motivation. Maybe sometimes it's high. I don't know about the history of Islam. I'd be shocked if the history of Islam was simply that there were people that wanted to spread Islam, and that was the only motivation, that there wasn't, yeah. Yeah, I don't know enough about it to know, but.
Just like the expansion of why did Europeans go into Africa? Why did you go into, into America? So it was still about resources, right? It was about more wealth for the empire. It was about more land. So it's still the same thing. There are always people who like, enough is never going to be enough, and they want more. They want to expand their empire.
And I think the period is after the being different. Nothing to do with resources. It's how we think, how we perceive things. So if we perceive him as different, we have conflict.
No.
Now we need to get into why I perceive him as different.
It makes it easier to fight him if we perceive him as different. Whether it's I'm French and you're English, or I'm African and you're English. The fact that I can say you are an other and I am and we are us makes it easier for me to go into your land and take your stuff. It makes it easier for the us to go fight the other.
That's a different story. What you
No.
do as a result of perceiving him as different, it's another story. You take resources, you do many things, But I'm curious why, and this is what I'm engaged in, why I resist somebody just for something that I have my own explanations, but it's nothing to do with resources.
So,
It's more
nothing
psychological.
I've said says you, in fact, everything I've said is that we're going to resist people. I'm talking about violence. We're not going to go into violence unless there's competition over scarce resources.
Not necessarily scarce resources. We think there are scarce
Well,
resources.
think, or however you want to say it.
Or we justify it by...
But it's not just because we're different, although because we're different, we are and different in certain ways. Like you have a slightly different accent, but honestly, I know you're sort of one of me, and you're a different color, and I do have a different reaction to you. So your accent I've accommodated to my tribe, and yours...
But you're talking about different levels of resistance. It's a different thing.
Yeah, so I really just want to talk about violence, and I want to stay focused, because I'm sure everyone has a... I'm just going to move on to one more slide here, and then, because some of the points are going to come up, and if you think they... And I can't address everything here in all this, and I want to address one thing, and that is religion the source of basically violence and terrorism in our world today? And you already brought up some points about this. Honestly, I think if you went to Ireland in the late 19th and early 20th century and you asked people, why are you fighting? They would probably tell you because they don't want to be ruled by the Brits. It's autonomy. If you read reports in the United States, it was always Protestants versus Catholics. That's the way it was always done. My guess is there wasn't a Catholic in Ireland in the 20th century that could tell you about the doctrine of transubstantiation or the real presence of the Lord in the Mass or something like that. I just don't think religious views played one bit of the role that was involved there. We already heard, I give the example of Bosnia, but we already heard this morning, we talk about how it's Muslims and Christians. That's how we think of it in our day and age. And, oh shoot, what was the guy's name today? From the guy who actually negotiated with those folks said religion had nothing to do with it whatsoever. And I wonder the same thing about ISIS. I'll put that off just a little bit. I wonder how much they're motivated by religion and how much they're motivated by other things. But I think attributing the source of violence to the religion commits what's called the fundamental attribution error. And this is attributing the cause of behavior to internal factors such as personality traits while minimizing or ignoring external situational factors. This is an important concept for the things I want to say, so I want to spend a little time with it. I don't do this in my own case, so I don't commit the fundamental attribution error in my own case, and neither do you. So, for example, if I were to show up late tonight, I'd walk in and I'd say, oh, the traffic was so bad, or I had an important phone call to make, I'm sorry. And it would be external circumstances, ones that relieved me of any moral culpability. But if you show up late, and we do this instantly to everybody, if you show up late or you do something that we think is wrong, we attribute it to a single character flaw. You're irresponsible, you don't really care about other people, you're flippant with your use of time, and we ignore possible external causes when it's other people. We do this all the time. We make ourselves out to be virtuous and other people out to be vicious. And we assign it to a single character flaw on the part of other people. Well, it's easy to do. So when Arabs or Muslims commit an act of violence, we instantly believe it's due to their faith. We do it just like that, and all the while ignoring possible and even likely contributing causes. So this is how it applies in violence. By the way, if a white Christian in America does anything wrong, we think they're crazy. If a Muslim does it, we think it's because of their religion. That's just, and in so doing, we commit the fundamental attribution error. So let me give you an example. Muhammad Atta. We've already heard, I don't know if we've heard about 9/11. Paul and I went to a play last night that had 9/11 in it. He was the mastermind behind 9/11. And he wrote this, and I read a book by a famous, Harvard something, famous person that works in religion and terrorism. I can't remember the guy's name. He said, this is the single most important document for understanding the Muslim mind that's been written in the 21st century. And I have the key quotes here. This document from Muhammad Atta that says why he masterminded 9/11. He writes this. So remember God, as he said in his book, O Lord, pour your patience upon us and make our feet steadfast and give us victory over the infidels. And his words, and the only thing they said, Lord, forgive our sins and excesses and make our feet steadfast and give us victory over the infidels. And his prophet said, O Lord, you have revealed the book. You moved the cloud. You gave us victory over the enemy. Conquer them and give us victory over them. Give us victory and make the ground shake under their feet. Pray for yourself and all your brothers that they may be victorious and hit their targets. And ask God to grant you martyrdom facing the enemy, not running away from it. And for him to grant you patience and the feeling that anything that happens to you is for him. So you might think that Muhammad Atta masterminded 9/11 because he was a really good and faithful Muslim. Except we know this about him. He almost never went to a mosque. He almost never said daily prayers. He got drunk almost every night, snorted cocaine. His girlfriend was a stripper. He ate pork. I'm not seeing a whole lot of Muslim submission, actually, in that. And so when his stripper girlfriend broke up with him, he broke into her apartment, and she had 6 or 7 kittens. Her cat had kittens. He dismembered the cats, and deposited cat parts all over the apartment so she would remember him long after he died. When you find out that about him, this looks like it's more reputation management than it is a pious confession of faith. I don't know why he did it, by the way. I have no idea whatsoever. I don't think Islamic piety was the motivation.
It exactly reinforces that it's not those reasons. It's not the religion and it's not the resources. There is an explicit explanation and there is implicit explanation. And what's more interesting is the implicit explanation to all those actions, I think.
Yeah, in his case, I think we don't know. I mean, I think he sort of died with
We
this.
just assume different things that we
Yeah.
know from psychology and philosophy.
Yeah. In some other cases, I think we can know. I mean, there are other ways to tell, but in his case, I think we just don't know what motivated it.
Something to correct. The words of Muhammad Atta are not words of God. Those are not found anywhere in any revealed book of God. Neither the Quran nor from the Sunnah of the Prophet, peace be upon him. So it was just his personal expression, maybe towards the anger he had against the community and so on, but they are not found anywhere in the holy books.
Excuse me, an interesting footnote. Muhammad Atta's mother and one of the mothers of a man who died in 9/11 actually go on tour together about how they love each other in spite of what happened, and then it was a tragedy for both of them, and how they're both representing their true faiths.
So will you send me a link to that? I do have a webpage, Abraham's Children, and I try to keep up good news about children of Abraham that actually get along. And if you wouldn't mind, love to get your link. And if you are on Facebook, I hope you sign up for that page. But we do try to give the positive side of the Abrahamic religions. Love to put that one on there. So the title of my talk was Dangerously Uninformed. And I hope I've made the case that attributing violence, at least all violence, to religion is uninformed. And I have some other quotations. Again, I'm just going to cite some authorities here. England's MI5 Behavioral Science Unit had a secret report which was leaked to The Guardian. And in this report, they said, far from being religious zealots, a large number of those involved in terrorism do not practice their faith regularly. Many lack religious literacy and are religious novices. And in fact, one thing they found out was that a regular attendance in a mosque was something that predicted peace, not violence. We all, of course, know anecdotes of mosques that are bad and where people have been radicalized by them. But there are 1.5 billion Muslims in the world. They're mostly in favor of peace, and most of the mosques are peace mosques. And being a regular attender in a mosque inoculates people, by and large, against radicalism. Lydia Wilson at Oxford University interviewed a lot of ISIS prisoners, and she reports that they're woefully ignorant of Islam and unable to answer questions about Sharia, jihad, and the caliphate. So to me, it's no surprise to find out that there were two Brits that radicalized, and they were going to go fight in the jihad. They got caught at the airport, and they found in their luggage the Quran for Dummies. They were motivated by other reasons, not by religion. And Scott Atran, who I think has talked to more terrorists than anyone in the world, and if you're not familiar with his work on religion and violence, it's really terrific. He says, what inspires terrorists is not so much the Quran or religious teachings as a thrilling cause and a call to action that promises glory and esteem in the eyes of friends. And through friends, eternal respect and remembrance in the wider world. Jihad is thrilling, glorious, and cool. I think I'll stop with those quotes. So I said it's dangerously uninformed, and I've tried to build into human psychology into an account of human psychology why it's uninformed. I just have two more slides, and then I'll just throw it open. Why is this dangerous? Why are Dawkins and Dennett's views, and really the views of about 90% of Americans and probably the rest of the world, thinking that religion is the cause of violence? Why is that dangerous, not just uninformed? Well, ISIS recruits by trying to increase Islamophobia in the West. That's their goal. They think that most Muslims in the West live in the gray zone, in between being an infidel and being a true believer, and a true believer is to join the jihad. Most people are in the gray zone. And what they're trying to do, you can read this, by the way, in you can read their philosophy in the book, The Management of Savagery. If you haven't read it, it's worth taking, and you're interested in religion and violence, read The Management of Savagery. It lays out their blueprint. It was written, I think, 2006, 2007. And they do terrorism in the West, just a little bit, just enough to get the rest of us to think this, that it's terrorism by Muslims who are motivated by Islam. Islam is evil, so Muslims are evil. And it's a short step from that for us to Islamophobia. And so they're trying to attract people through this. They want to get non-Muslims to hate Islam and then to want to harm Muslims. They want us to rain down bombs on innocent people in Syria. That's what they want, and we're doing it. So if moderate Muslims feel alienated and unsafe as a result of prejudice, they'll be forced out of the gray zone and into the light, into jihad. This is ISIS's strategy. So when we tar Islam with the extremist brush, all of Islam, all 1.5 billion Muslims, when we tar Islam with the extremist brush, we perpetuate the myth that Islam is violent and that Muslims are violent. And then we're on to Islamophobia. And when people feel threatened, they want to fight. This is ISIS's strategy. That's a dangerous part. Now, that's about them. Here's the part about us, and us is us/US, too. That's my cleverness. Attributing extremism to religion and ignoring external conditions makes extremism their problem. So they are entirely responsible, and they need to change. I hear this all the time. Why don't moderate Muslims speak out against violence? Of course they do. You all know they do. All of you Muslims, I know they do, and probably most of you people who are here know they do because you work in conflict resolution in the Abrahamic tradition. You know they do. Hundreds of thousands of them. And I'm going to tell you why they're doing it. Because of kin, family, and tribe. No one is more threatened by ISIS by death than Muslims. No, we Americans, there were 50 that were killed last year. How many Muslims were killed in Syria last year? 10, 15,000? Mostly innocent people. Nobody has more to fear from ISIS than Muslims. But we think it's their problem. The problem is Islam. It's their problem. And it's their problem because the fault is their religion. So they need to change. But and this is back to the fundamental attribution error. If extremism is motivated by external conditions, then the people who created those conditions are responsible. And I can't remember who said this, but it's a great quote. We cannot even begin to prevent violence until we can acknowledge what we ourselves are doing that contributes to it actively or passively. And we can do all the conflict resolution we want, but if we don't stop the conditions that create violence, it isn't going to stop. It won't go away. And I just did a little quick go through, what are the things that we have done in the U.S., in the West, that contribute to the conditions that have created ISIS, created space for ISIS in the Ottoman Empire. When it collapsed, France and England mostly, but we, the U.S., benefited. We divided up the Middle East according to ways that would benefit us financially and not the people that live there. It was all to our economic benefit. I won't go back to colonialism. Of course, that's an obvious story to tell. We had cheap oil for a long time because we made a pact with Saudi Arabia and they made a pact with their clerics that they could do whatever they wanted and live the way they wanted. And then the clerics, they got to do whatever they wanted. And what Saudi clerics did was export Wahhabism around the world. We funded that with cheap oil. It wasn't a secret where radical Islamism started in the Saudi Arabia, funded by us paying for cheap oil. Iraq, they didn't have weapons of mass destruction. Saddam Hussein may have been a wicked tyrant, but life was pretty good under him. He was a pretty good wicked tyrant. And getting rid of him and then thinking that they would accept us as conquerors, conquering heroes, was a massive cultural failure, and tribalism just took off. I think Iraq may be the greatest foreign policy disaster in the history of the world, certainly in the history of the United States. We have unleashed untold forces for evil by invading Iraq. We had torture chambers where lots of innocent people were tortured. We don't think white American human beings should be tortured, but it's okay to torture them Muslims, I think. We had Guantanamo where people were kept. We know they were innocent. We know people had nothing to do with it. Afghanis were paid $5,000 to turn in people. There were Afghani farmers everywhere turning in people. We knew within 6 months of innocent people there, and it took 10 years to get some out, and there are people still there. Guantanamo is a shame. Libya, we got rid of Gaddafi. Again, maybe he was a terrible dictator. He was a dictator. He wasn't so terrible. The circumstances there now are absolutely awful. It's tribal warfare everywhere in Libya. I'm not going to vote for Trump, but Hillary is the reason we invaded Libya, and it was a big mistake. And we created the conditions of that are hospitable to ISIS. Our drone policy, I think, is totally irrational. We like to think in America that it only targets really bad people, but drones fly around, buzz, 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 creating fear in the hearts of kids who, by age 10, already have post-traumatic stress disorder. Their bombs go down and kill innocent people. Families run to help. We figure out, oh, we didn't get the right person. We bomb again the people that ran to help. Our drone policy has probably done more to recruit for ISIS than any imam in the world. We have contributed to the conditions for ISIS. And I think we need to take responsibility for the harm and humiliations of Arabs. And the list could go on. Of course, I'll just use Arabs here, which have inspired violence. We've threatened and harmed their self, kin, and tribe. Land, food, water, autonomy, and honor, and they have responded with fight. And honestly, why not? Since we contributed to conditions that motivate extremism, we need to work with our Muslim brothers and sisters to create instead conditions of justice, equality, and peace. So we can do all the conflict resolution we want. If we don't deal with this, until the injustices go away, and we take responsibility for our part in the injustices, and we stop them and fix them, Until that happens, there isn't going to be peace in the world. All right, floor is open for questions.
All right. Thank you so much, Professor Kelly James Clark. I think this is a very important, very crucial topic that you discussed. No wonder we had responses immediately before you ended your lecture. I have a few comments to make as a response to this from the perspective of conflict resolution, coming from a conflict resolution perspective. And one of the things that I noted here as you were talking, I took this, that conflict arises over threats to self, kin, and tribe, land, food, water, autonomy, honor, and shame, not religion. I think this summarizes what you said, but I want to talk about honor and shame. And you just ended here with a very important term, humiliation. And some scholars have written on dehumanization, which also comes from that humiliation, and which said a threat to honor are very important. And I know there are many scholars like Avarish, Ashburger, Hosted, in culture and conflict have written very important text trying to describe pretext, context, and conflict, especially in culture-motivated conflicts. And I think the questions that emerged as you were talking, for me, have to do with a clear distinction between identity, religion, culture, and resources. Where is actually the distinction? Because often we use the term identity when one's identity is threatened, or culture. So I think here we could you could help us with our distinction. What's the difference between identity, culture, and religion? That's number one. Number two question I want to ask is, I think we're in November. In October, John Kerry, the Secretary of State, John Kerry, traveled to Nigeria. That was September 24th. He traveled to Nigeria and September 23rd. And he met with the Muslim leaders in the northern part of Nigeria. In fact, that was to be an official diplomatic mission. So he met with Muslim leaders in the northern part of Nigeria, excluded the Christians in the south. And he also met with the Muslim northern governors in the northern part of Nigeria, and excluded the southern governors. So the response to that was very problematic for his diplomatic mission. And the Christian Association of Nigeria publicly criticized his intervention, which was honestly to find a way to mitigate violent extremism that is posed by, and terrorism by Boko Haram. Find a solution to that. And so why I raise this issue is that the Southerners and the Christians felt threatened. I think it's a question of honor. And so as conflict resolution practitioners, how do we actually mitigate? I know scholars have made a distinction between high context culture and low context culture. I think so when a high context culture and a low context culture collide, what happens?
All right, so I'm just a philosopher, not a culture critic, or I don't even do much in conflict resolution. I just read what you guys say about it. And so you had lots of things that are really big terms and they're really hard, and lots of them I don't know. So bottom line, I have no idea about high context. I don't even know what a high context or low context culture is. I also don't really even know what religion is. Like, I don't think there's a good definition of religion, and there's not one that separates it from culture, or like, we can use it when we talk about the Abrahamic religion and religions, and we can use it to talk about Christianity and Judaism and Islam, but to talk about everything that everyone we might think is a religion, it's really hard to come up with a definition even of religion. So this is a long way of saying I don't know to almost everything you said. I did understand that when the people weren't invited, they felt dishonored, and that is not a good thing. Again, honor and shame are independent of their religious beliefs. They didn't get invited because they were the enemy. That was the real reason they didn't get invited, and they were going to try to move it along without those people being in the room, because I take it conflict resolution is a lot easier if you're only talking to one side. And they thought maybe they could get that somewhere without that side, but not including both sides means people feel rightly left out and dishonored, and then that's just going to slow the process down, it seems to me. Yeah.
Just to kind of, can you ask your first question again? Just the last part that you said about. Yeah.
Okay. The last question?
No, the first question, but just the last few sentences.
I can't remember again.
What was the question itself? Was like, why is religion considered a culture or something like that?
Yeah, I was asked today about the distinction between identity, religion,
and culture.
Identity,
okay, can I?
Religion, culture, and resources.
No. And resources? Okay. Can I answer Okay. Oh, the meeting point of all that?
Yeah.
So I can tell you, like, as a Muslim, so Islam is your culture. Like, when you're or even Christianity is your culture, because what culture does is give you, like, a set of rules to abide by, like, whether it's American culture or, like, Nigerian culture. You know what I mean? So I think, like, religion is like a global culture. Wherever you go, you are a Muslim, and if you meet other Muslims, like, for instance, when we're walking down the street today, and especially my sister here, who's identifiably a Muslim because she wears hijab, so other Muslims will see her, and they'll say hi and how are you, because she's identifiably Muslim, and they're Muslim, and so you have that kind of, kinship? Relationship to them, right? Tribal relationship to them. So it's part of your identity, especially a religion like Islam, where you are very identifiably Muslim, whether you're a man or a woman. You know what I mean? You can be very identifiably a Muslim, whether you're a man or a woman. And I think what it does, as far as tribalism goes, is it gives us a sense of, like, protection for our own. So when you see something happening to someone, even if they're far away from you, if they're Christian or if they're Muslim, you're gonna feel some type of way about it if they're part of your tribe. You know what I mean? So I think that's what it does. And when it comes to resources, it's very easy. Like, there's not a cultural dissidence between the Muslims in America about, like, why the things that are happening in the Middle East are happening in the Middle East. We don't feel like, even though we love America, we don't feel like America is, like, without sin. You know what I mean? Like, nobody's without sin. Everybody has their thing that they did wrong, you know? But I just feel like sometimes Americans can't admit to themselves that what their government is doing is wrong, because then it's so hard to change it. Even here with things that we want for ourselves, like when Wall Street took over and took all our money and we had to go into a recession, it's so hard to fight Wall Street. So what did we do? Blamed it on the immigrants. That's not fair. You know perfectly well the immigrants didn't cause your global financial crisis. It didn't cause the financial crisis here. It's, you know what I mean? Like, this is not your problem. The problem is these people who have the money, who have the power, who are taking their money and their power to, you know, to hurt.
We have
to hurt us. Yeah.
Lots of other questions, so you probably better.
Yeah. But so when it comes to resources, we can very easily see how America or whoever going in and taking these resources, how it's hurting the Muslim population there. And so this is why, I guess, if you want to say how that kinship works out, just the same way you could be here and something is happening in Nigeria, you're still going to feel it, even though you may be Nigerian American. Do you know what I mean? So I hope that answers.
All right, thanks. We'll start with, take a couple people we haven't heard from yet, and then we'll get to you too.
Hi, thanks. So I'm a bit surprised at the broad brush of the presentation, which seems to suggest that violence is never inspired by religion. So my question is, are there particular situations where you might say, yes, that is religion-inspired violence? For example, competition over sacred land, where the land is particularly considered sacred by multiple groups and they fight over that. There's violence as a result of that. Or how would you describe forced conversions because of, I think, fear of death, right? So I think fear of death can also be a trigger for violence, which is based on what religions say happens after death. And therefore, the fear of that death might trigger violence on behalf of trying to assert one's religion over another. So I'm wondering if in your model or research there are any particular components of violence that you might say are inspired by.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I said it's typically, I cover a lot of ground, as you noticed. I think it's typically low on the structure of motivation. It probably can be relatively high or relatively low. I'd have to hear more about the specifics of any situation, like if somebody is motivated by fear of death, that sounds like fear of death, which is one of your basic, one of our most basic fears. And then there are factual, people might have factual disagreements. This is why culture is really hard to separate. Sorry, religion, culture, politics, it's all super hard to separate out, like we can sort of discreetly separate them out. So anyway, if I were writing a whole book on this, I'd try to make it a lot more nuanced and then try to figure out case by case. I'd say in general.
So that's what I think would be helpful to me, is some examples of when violence is motivated by religion, what those particulars are, which would help me understand. If it's a low instance, it would still help me better understand the model.
Can you give me one that just leaps to mind where you're pretty sure that it is just religion and it's not somebody's fear of death or taking of land or lack of honor or shame or something like that? I don't mean to keep blathering, I just...
So for me, it doesn't have to be just religion. I'm particularly interested in when religion is a component of a more complex conflict. Because I think what happens, I find, is that a lot of people are so frightened of saying there's a religion component that they explain it away because it feels so out of control if it gets explained in that way. And so what I try to assert is, yes, there's land, resources, water, but there's also a layer of religion that's at play in some conflicts that has to be addressed in order to make progress on the tangible issues of land, water, etc.
So I guess I think, I don't know exactly what you think I said that made me say it's never religion or that doesn't play a role. I said it's low in the structure of, most of the time it's typically low in the structure of motivations. And we tend to think it's really high because we think that's the thing that identifies people over all these other things. And I think we have multiple identities that are really complex almost all the time. I think it would be really hard to and I think it would be really bizarre to think that people were getting along perfectly fine for no other reason and then they just started fighting because they had religious differences. And we tell histories like that's the case, like the Pope went in and invaded the Holy Land because he wanted to kill infidels. That's a way to tell it, but I take it there's probably a more plausible socioeconomic story to tell about what happened there. I don't know exactly. Anyway, I don't think it never plays a role, and I think it can move up and down in the structure of motivations, but it would shock me if what wasn't really moving things at some level were the more basic human needs and fears. And then sometimes probably appeals to those by people like this but I have to think of a specific example than rather just abstract. But I could be persuaded that sometimes that's what's happening. Well, she hasn't spoken yet. He hasn't, and he hasn't. And I told them, oh, you haven't? You did talk to me at lunch, though. But I'm going to let you do it here. Go ahead.
No, you had your hand up before me.
Okay, what I am saying to answer your question, there's a time in which values such as those in religion become something we own, that is our protector. And when that is violated, then it is something that is part of our protection and our resource for living that is challenged, that is threatened. And therefore the shame and the need to protect it out of honor. And that's how I see religion comes in. Not because I pray 10 times a day or I do this, but because it is something that I hold dear and it's part of what enables me to, it provides me with my ideas and my rules for living. And if you're going to challenge that, you know, for example, when Muslim women, the way they dress, if Americans start to go in there and young American women in shorts, when according to the Muslim men, their women should be covered, that's threatening to how they organize their relationship with women. And so that's something to be, that's how I see it.
Yeah.
At the Community of Living Traditions, we actively, as Muslims, Jews, and Christians, seek to decolonize our faith. And by that, I mean remove any form of systemic racism or privilege that allows one religion to think it is entitled to universal human rights and nonviolence when others are not. I mean, everyone is entitled to universal human rights and nonviolence. So, for example, if we look at Zionism, and you keep mentioning, you know, an example of like Holy Land. Zionism did not need to be racist. The idea of Jews going back to the Holy Land is a beautiful thing. But in fact, the way it happened, you know, with the exodus of 850,000 Palestinians in 1948, and then the murder and all of that, we have 6-7 million Palestinians in the diaspora, and that, you know, everything. So that was actually not following religion, but having Jewish people, because of their fear and trauma from the Holocaust, actually breaking the 10 Commandments by robbing, by stealing, by killing, by coveting. They actually abdicated their religion because of trauma. So what we want to do is have a situation where Muslims, Jews, and Christians can live together, eat sweets, drink tea together, and just love on each other, and that's the real religion. And same thing for Muslims. When Muslims do evil things, they have abdicated their religion.
I speak French, but my English is very morse, donc I speak French. Basil was translate. Thank you for your presentation. Merci beaucoup, parce que au départ c'est un peu déroutant, on ne sait pas où on va, on ne sait pas où vous nous amenez. Hein?
Thank you for your presentation. We haven't enough time, so we actually don't know where to go.
Voilà, on voit défiler le PowerPoint et les idées, ça se recoupe. On voit que vous êtes dans une démarche déconstructive, vous êtes en train de tordre le cou à un ensemble de préjugés qui sont massifs dans notre société, qui nous empêchent de vivre ensemble.
So we hope that there's already a PowerPoint presentation that you could the slides share with us.
Oh yeah, if anyone wants these, I'll figure out how to get them to people.
So that we are able to really understand the logic of your discussion.
Voilà. Donc, ceci étant, la première question que je voulais vous poser, c'est quelle dimension, les auteurs que vous avez cités au début, quelle est la dimension qu'ils donnent à la religion? Qu'est-ce qu'ils privilégient dans la religion? Est-ce le politique ou le côté spirituel?
So the first question I want to ask you is, what is the direction of the authors that you mentioned in your presentation? What is the basic argument? Are they political arguments or socio-economic arguments.
For the people that I cited?
Yeah, the people, the authors you cited when you were making your presentation.
Like Scott Atran and...
Au départ, au début de la présentation, la religion est présentée comme un poison, comme la route du diable. Voilà.
Est-ce que tu as noté
Oui,
l'auteur?
Non, je n'ai pas noté les noms, mais c'est au début. La première
So you
slide.
didn't write down the name, but
On the first slide, or?
Yes, first slide.
Voilà.
You know, your presentation.
La deuxième chose rapidement, et je vais m'arrêter à ça, je ne vais pas monopoliser la parole, c'est la question de l'identité finalement. Dans ce que vous développez, c'est celle-là qui reste. La terre, le sang, comme le disait Ernest Renan dans les années 1800, hein, la terre, le sang, les habitudes culturelles qu'on a construites sont celles auxquelles on s'attache et pour lesquelles on tue finalement, beaucoup plus que la religion, parce que la religion vient tardivement se greffer à ce tamas de valeurs sociales, culturelles, territoriales qui existent. Est-ce qu'aujourd'hui, la vérité, ce n'est pas cette question de dire qu'il n'y a pas une identité monolithique, que toute identité est faite d'échanges, est construite sur la base d'alluvions, que le zéro, par exemple, nous vient des Arabes. Est-ce que ce n'est pas vers ça aujourd'hui qu'on peut construire notre vivre ensemble?
Yeah, that was very long, but I'll summarize it. The most important thing that actually comes from your presentation has to do with identity. And his question is, today, are we actually not talking about one identity that is a kind of particular one identity that's monolithic. Yeah. So mono identity, like one identity. And what is the implication of one identity? Because you have le sang,
le
right?
sang, le sol, on a parlé de la nourriture, on a parlé de tout cela.
Yeah.
Mais est-ce qu'aujourd'hui, c'est pas ça le vrai problème?
So if today the
Au-delà de la religion.
right, so that religion is also part of identity, comes from there. Cultural issues come from there. So are we not actually talking about identity because the fight for economic resources, and we're talking about the land and all that comes with it. So isn't it really a fight about identity?
No, didn't he say that? I'm sorry. Didn't he say that religion comes after all these other identities? Like, you first, before religion came into play, like we had our kinship and our cultures and all this stuff, and religion came into play after that? I thought I heard that.
Yeah, exactly. So that
You mean historically, or?
Yeah, religion has to do, that comes from, cultural identity and all that. So that kind of identity is like cultural identity, product of, religion is a product of that. So I think that's just our...
Religion is part of that, did you say?
Yes. Part of the identity.
Yeah, I spoke with you in the break, but I do want to say something about this. This is exactly, I'm writing my dissertation exactly about that. And I found that the resistance to other and the hatred toward other is about identity. And religion and all beliefs and attitudes and everything, once we encounter somebody who has different beliefs or different attitudes, we reject it. Why? Because we have built our identity over many years, and all of a sudden we encounter somebody who thinks differently, and beliefs are the building blocks of identity. And when we encounter that, we defend it, we get attached to it. There's a lot of research on it, and this is how it belongs, how it relates to conflict. Okay? It's our automatic reaction, it's unconscious. We defend, we very strongly defend our identity. This is what happens. So sometimes it translates into religion, and sometimes to resources, and to many other things that we explain explicitly because we do not know to explain the implicit reasons of attaching to our identity. This is what I have been founding in my research.
I don't have much. I want to make one response to your comment. I backed into this topic myself. I work on cognitive science of religion, and so I was working initially on religion and cooperation, and that came late because I was just looking initially at like agency detecting device and theory of mind and how they incline people to religious belief. And then I read a lot of stuff about cooperation. Then I went to a conference and actually sat next to Richard Dawkins on religion and violence, and I thought, well, okay, this is it. Religion's. I just thought that was it, and. So then I just got really interested in it. And what changed my mind, by and large, about it, I'm happy to be persuaded otherwise, is, I sort of bought the Dawkins, Dennett, Harris line, but then it just didn't seem to fit with human psychology the way I was figuring it out in cognitive science of religion. It seemed to elevate religion to some status that, our basic fight or flight instincts had. And anyway, I could be persuaded otherwise, but it just didn't seem to fit with the actual structure of human motivation most of the time. And I actually think we're mostly a sort of mass of unacknowledged biases that move us to act in various ways. And then we tell a story, we rationalize it in certain ways, but the stories all come later and they're not very good, they don't fit very well. But I think we're more instinctive than we like to think or say. And so we act or react. And then rationalizations come later. Religion's often part of the rationalization, but it's not the thing that moved us most of the time. But anyway, I could be persuaded otherwise. It doesn't seem to fit what I'd learned about human psychology very well. And then I read what other people said who actually work on it, like Scott Atran, and who actually talk to people.
On the identity issue, some really well-known historian, anthropologist has suggested that there is not a word for religion until the 18th century.
Right, it was invented late.
Now, if you take 15 seconds to think about that there was no word for religion until the 18th century, what does that tell you about identity formation? It tells you that the fundamental reality, it seems to me, and I'm not, I teach drama and literature, I don't know anything about this stuff, but what it says to me is that identity is primarily cultural. Religious life, as we now separated out church and state and all that since the Enlightenment, has always been a part of the fabric of that. And so you talk about cultural identity, personal identification within an enculturation process that involves what we now call religious elements, but all of those elements are inextricably bound as a complex tapestry that have, it seems to me, at its base, the tribal protection of land, resources, and have to do with honor and shame, tribal honor and shame. And the gods are called upon, the goddesses are called upon, no gods are called upon. It doesn't really impact. And ISIS has made us all nervous and trying to separate out the religious impulse, it seems to me, wrongly, that inspires this kind of identification, cultural identification that tries to create a caliphate. It's really about brothers joining together and having land and having no alienation anymore. It seems to me, as I understand the ISIS movement, which of course is just 1% of Islam. So I think identity is at the core of it. And if we realize that there was no religion parceled out as a word before the 18th century, I think we can better understand what identity is all about. It's got very little to do with what we isolate as religion.
Yeah, that's partly why I didn't want to answer the identity question or the culture question or the religion question. They're all really modern constructs that we think sort of separate out in some really, and politics, like there's religion, there's politics, and then they're all things that would have been inextricably intertwined in any early human culture in ways we can't possibly imagine. and in ours in ways we can't possibly imagine, but we think we can sort of tease them out in ways that are useful, and it seems to me they're not so useful. He hasn't said, and this poor fella here hasn't said anything yet.
No, I wanted to respond to this.
It's probably already passed by, but given we're talking about modern, the way we mark things in the modern times, religion has become, for one reason or another, a tribal marker, and a big tribal marker. And it's easy, as you say, the Protestants against the Catholics in Northern Ireland. Well, that was not quite what it was about, right? But it's become that. The thing about identity, though, that is, if it's a threat to our identity, well, the identity is the self. And so whatever would be a threat there would become.
Yeah. An honor and shame factor into those.
Well,
yeah.
Thank you for a very interesting lecture, and I will try to keep it short. I can't promise anything because I disagreed with almost everything you said. I will try to
go easy on me.
But a few points. First, it's not always about resources. The crusade wasn't mostly or only about resources. The Spanish Inquisition had nothing to do with resources.
Oh, sorry. Well, power, or autonomy. I mean, there are lots of other things I could have added. I tried to keep it short, but...
Persecuting gay people because they are gay has nothing to do with resources. It has to do with religious hatred.
No, honestly...
What does it have to do with resources?
It's pretty clear that human beings have sort of instinctive reactions to this, and then religion came along, and many religions, including Christianity, sort of endorsed this sort of initial disgust reaction people have. I think there's a better evolutionary story to tell about how it is that human beings came to, honestly, I favor gay marriage and I'm not opposed to homosexuality, so I don't mean to say this, but to blame, it's just a mistake. It's a empirical mistake to think that homosexuality wasn't considered wrong until religion decided it was.
This is besides the point. Doesn't mean that religion doesn't encourage homophobia and discrimination against gays. Even in the US today, more people are willing to have a black president or a gay president than to have an atheist president. It doesn't have to do with resources. It has to do with the intolerant nature of religion.
No, it has to do with people being members of our tribe, and so an atheist isn't a member of our tribe, so it's hard for people to know they can trust. So I agree that atheists aren't trusted, but it's who do you trust and how do you trust them? And people wrongly think you can't trust atheists, but I don't think it's the religion that's driving it. I think it's some deep sense of who can you trust or not, and the tribal marker is religion. So I agree, there are tribal markers for who you get to attack and who you don't, who you disagree with and who you don't. I don't see how anything I said would have disagreed with that.
Even if I subscribe to your view and say that everything is about resources at the end, eventually everything is about resources, you agree that religion makes things worse. No. Religion aggravates disputes. And we need to ask ourselves, why is that the case? What is there in religion that makes things worse? And the only possible answer is that religion is inherently intolerant. Religion allows...
Why is that the only answer?
Because there's no other answer. Religion allows more... Religion, by its nature, is divisive. Religion allows people to act more violently than they would have without religion. This is the only explanation for religion making things worse. For religion taking disputes which are in principle solvable and making them insolvable.
No.
You referred to...
So can we just take one point at a time? You can write your refutation of everything I say somewhere else, but so religion does sometimes increase intolerance. And I said it's a force multiplier and it's a motivator. So totally agree. I said that out there. I don't think it's the major thing driving these things, but if some disagreement is moving, religion can add motive force to it in a negative way. So that's what I said in my talk. It can be a motivator and it can be a force multiplier, and not in a good sense. So totally agree with that. I don't think it's the deep thing that's really moving people generally, but And I think it, in general, like everything else in culture, is a divider and intolerant. I think we're pretty serious dividers. We're very tribalistic. Everything counts in tribe and out tribe. We think religion is especially like this, and maybe it is, maybe it isn't. Tomorrow I'm going to talk about how it can be in the morning at 9. I hope you come back about how religion can be a force for good. That's the point about tomorrow. So, but it can be a force for evil. I'm not disputing that. If you're quick, because you have a tendency to not be quick, so I'm just going to...
Super quick. So basically the thing is, like, as people, we're always going to find a way to divide. Even if you don't have a religion, we're going to find a way to divide. The only thing that religion does is that, like he said, it's a multiplier. So whereas before, your tribe may be small and my tribe may be small, but if you add religion to it, it's not just your physical location, it's your global tribe. So it makes it seem like that, but it's not the religion that's making the conflict unsolvable. If anything, I think religion helps to solve the conflict if we really acted in our true religious natures, like as true Muslims and as true Christians and as true Jews, and followed the tenets of our faith instead of what we want to follow. You know, I think it would really.
Okay, so I'm going to just make his point and agree with him on this. Everything we have can be used for our tribalism, our selfish nature, and it's really hard to get the true religion sort of to get us to humanize, and that's why things are not in a good condition. And so I think generally we take our religion and use it for our own selfish ends. That's what we generally do, because that's the way we are. And it's really hard to have it motivate compassion. It's really hard to do it. Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to offer another possibility for religion being intolerant. I wonder if religion answers some of the unknowables, right? Those things that we can't know. What happens after death? There are things that religion answers that require a leap of faith. And then we're willing to fight for the answers that we believe in because they help us organize and feel more secure in the world. So I think that's part of why religion's a multiplier, because it's not things that we can know, and yet it's things that help us feel safer and more secure in our day-to-day, and so we fight for that security.
So it is a source of intolerance.
But it's not. It's not about, well, it's
Just
not a
explain
focus
why
on.
is
It's
that
not. I wouldn't focus it on intolerance, because when I hear you say that, I think what I'm hearing is, because the religion specifically says, don't like these people, don't like these people, don't like these people, and I don't think that's the operative piece of it. I think it's more the security it gives people on the unknowables, and therefore you're going to fight for it.
I want to say, Rogers and Hammerstein, so quickly we will fight to prove that what we do not know is so. But I don't remember my history that well, but I'm sure that there were plenty of economic reasons with the Crusades.
Absolutely.
And definitely to get rid of Constantinople, and so the Venetian cities could have more control over the trade. There definitely were other things involved.
I completely agree. My only question was, why was there a need to use religion as an excuse?
My guess is people in power use whatever they can to achieve their ends, and religion was a pretty handy thing to use. And and the same is true with, you ask why someone might, things we don't know, afterlife beliefs. The fact is, and this gets back to why Christians and Muslims don't trust atheists, looks like lots of religious rituals, including things to believe, were parts of what some psychologists have called hard to fake commitments. We really want to know who we can trust, because early human beings didn't trust other human beings, and so we had to know, like, who's one of us, and so the requirements for understanding who's one of us got pretty high, and it can mean what you believe. There are things we don't know, but it's not just like you don't know them. They do give you comfort, but also what seems to be going on is in various hard-to-fake commitments. It helps you know who really is in your tribe and who you can trust and who isn't going to, in the middle of the night, steal the grain or something like that. So the whole story is super complicated. I don't doubt that there are lots of other psychological mechanisms going on, and including involving hard-to-believe things. But and one book I'd recommend, if you haven't read it, the single best book on religion and cooperation is a book called High Gods by someone whose name I'm going to remember in an hour. Ara Noren Zion. High Gods. It's a best summary of the work on cooperation. It doesn't have that much on conflict, but High Gods is the name of the book. Yeah, it's a really great summary of. I think it's Ara Noren Zion who wrote High Gods. And it's the best single book on psychology of cooperation. Yeah, I'll remember tonight, believe me. In fact, I'm going to remember a really good answer to your question in about 30 minutes.